I can't believe I'm about to do this. Write all of this down, put my life on display for anyone to read. My name is Jules, and what I'm about to share isn't the life you think it is. I'm not the perfect daughter or the golden child. Far from it. This story starts with a betrayal that will change everything, and I promise, you'll never see the twist coming. It was the kind of evening that promised new beginnings, the kind of gathering you hoped for when you bought a house you intended to make a home. Josh was standing in the middle of his new living room, a glass of wine raised high as everyone turned their attention toward him. I watched him carefully, the slight glint in his eyes that always appeared when he was about to take the spotlight, his voice growing louder with each word. This wasn't just a housewarming party. This was a declaration, a performance. To new beginnings, to new homes, Josh announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. He paused, then added, his face momentarily serious, and to Grandpa's memory. The room fell into a hushed silence. I took a deep breath, raising my glass along with the others. The sting of Grandpa's absence was still fresh, too raw to ignore. Just 4 days ago, the man who had been like a second father to me was gone, his chair at the family table now empty. I clinked my glass against Josh's, the wine's bitterness barely registering as I tried to focus on the moment, but all I could think about was Grandpa, the times we'd spent together, the lessons he had shared, the countless afternoons on the porch swing. Josh set his drink down with deliberate care, wiping his lips as he gathered the room's attention again. Speaking of Grandpa, he said, his voice lighter now, almost too cheerful, I have an announcement. I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes flicked toward me, a brief look that made my stomach twist. I frowned instinctively. Something about his expression, the way he was building up to this moment, felt off. I forced myself to smile, though it felt strained. He reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope that looked worn at the edges, as though it had been handled over and over again. My heart skipped a beat. The envelope seemed out of place in his hand. Was he really about to do this now? Before I could make sense of my own confusion, Josh held the letter up for all to see. Grandpa left this for me, he said, his tone softening. Before he passed, he gave me this letter. He wanted me to have the cabin by the lake, the place we all loved. There was a murmur of surprise from the family. My parents' faces lit up, my mom beaming with pride as she patted Josh's back, while his girlfriend, Teresa, clapped with excitement. But all I could do was stare at him. The room felt like it was closing in on me. The lakeside cabin, Grandpa's most cherished possession, the one place he had always said he wanted to pass down to me. Wait, what? I found myself whispering, not even realizing I had spoken aloud. It was all too surreal. I had spent every weekend with Grandpa at that cabin for the past 3 years, working on the property, listening to his stories, talking about anything and everything. It was where I had felt the most connected to him, where I had come to understand what mattered most in life. Josh, he'd barely visited, complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi and how there's nothing to do there every time he came. He'd shown no real interest in the cabin or in Grandpa. And now, here he was, claiming it as his own. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I had been punched in the gut, my thoughts racing, my heart pounding in my chest. The words Josh was speaking didn't make sense. I didn't know whether to scream or cry or just walk out. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. That's great. Good for you, Josh, I said with a smile that felt more like a grimace. The words sounded hollow in my ears. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but it didn't go away. I needed to get out of there. I needed to breathe. Excusing myself with a quick, "I'll be right back," I turned and walked toward the bathroom. The house felt too small now, the walls pressing in on me, as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The moment the door closed behind me, I leaned against it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind spun, my thoughts tangled in a web of confusion. Why was Josh doing this? Did he know about the deed? Did Grandpa change his mind? My hand trembled as I pulled out my phone, sending a quick text to Jenna. You okay? That was weird. Josh never cared about the cabin. Jenna replied almost immediately. You're not the only one. Something's off about this, I typed back, my fingers shaking. I need to check something at home. Can you cover for me? Say I got called into work? Within minutes, Jenna had already texted my parents. I could see her words in my mind, playing out perfectly. Jules got a work emergency. She'll be back later. It was like they believed her without a second thought, and I was grateful. I could leave, but I didn't know what I was walking into. The drive home was a blur. Street lights passed by in streaks of orange and yellow, the rhythm of my tires on the road, the only constant. I tried to focus on the task ahead, getting home, finding the box Grandpa had left me, the one he had asked me not to open until I needed to know the truth. But my mind kept wandering back to the cabin. The memories flooded me. Grandpa teaching me how to fish off the dock, the way his eyes lit up when I arrived, the endless conversations on the porch swing, the calm presence he had always exuded. It wasn't just a piece of property to me, it was everything. It was where I had learned to be still, to embrace quiet moments, and find joy in simplicity. How could Josh think that this cabin, this sacred place, could be his just because he'd said so? It was more than a house. It was home. It was family. When I finally pulled into my apartment, I rushed up to my room, hands shaking as I reached into my closet. There it was. The wooden box Grandpa had given me 3 weeks ago, just before his passing. The cedar scent still clung to the surface, faint but familiar. I hesitated for a moment, the memories of Grandpa's final words still fresh in my mind. Don't open this until you need to know the truth. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside there were several folded documents, a sealed envelope with my name on it, and a small brass key. I knew what the key was for. It opened the antique roll-top desk in Grandpa's study at the cabin. I unfolded the top document and my heart skipped a beat. It was the deed. The notarized deed. It was already mine. The cabin had been legally transferred to me 6 months ago. And yet Josh had stood there tonight, fabricating a story. I sat back, stunned. How could he have lied so easily? How could he have tried to take something that was never his? The weight of the wooden box in my lap felt heavier than ever. My fingers were numb as I held the deed, staring at the familiar signature on the document. Grandpa's handwriting had become shaky in his final months, a mark of his deteriorating health, but there was no mistaking the words before me. The deed wasn't just a piece of paper, it was the culmination of everything Grandpa had wanted for me, the cabin, his legacy, the last piece of advice he had ever given me. I had promised him I would take care of it. I had promised him I would honor the place where so many of our memories had been made. I reached for the envelope with my name on it, my heart still racing. Grandpa's letter, the one he had written to me before he passed, was inside. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling as I read the familiar, shaky words. My dearest Jules, it began. By the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. I've decided to give you the cabin while I'm still alive to avoid any complications. You're the only one who truly loved this place as much as I did. Your brother never showed interest, except when he needed a place to host parties when I wasn't around. I swallowed hard, the words cutting deeper than I had expected. Grandpa knew. He had seen it too. The distance between Josh and him, the lack of connection Josh had ever felt with the cabin. I read the rest of the letter, and a lump formed in my throat. I trust you to honor the spirit of our special place. This cabin has always meant more to me than any material possession. You understand that, and I know you'll keep it safe. It's already yours, Jules. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter back up, the weight of Grandpa's trust pressing heavily on me. But something else gnawed at me, something more immediate, more urgent. Josh. He had been so confident tonight, so sure of himself, so certain that the cabin was his. But he didn't know. He didn't know that Grandpa had already given it to me. The letter, the deed, it all made sense now. Josh had no claim to it, and yet he had stood there with that smug expression on his face, as if everything was rightfully his. I could almost hear his voice in my head. Grandpa wanted me to have it. He had made that statement so effortlessly, so casually, as though he were speaking a truth everyone would accept. But the truth was different. Grandpa's wishes were clear. This wasn't about who could shout the loudest, this wasn't about who could make the most convincing speech, this was about the love Grandpa had for the cabin, and for me. I closed my eyes for a moment, my breath shaky. How did it come to this? Why had Josh lied? Was he so blinded by jealousy, by some twisted sense of entitlement, that he couldn't see what was right in front of him? I shook my head, still grappling with the weight of the discovery. Josh wasn't just lying to the family. He was lying to himself, too. He didn't understand the significance of the cabin. He hadn't seen it the way Grandpa and I had seen it. The lake, the trees, the stories shared beneath the stars. It was more than just a house. It was a symbol of all that had been passed down to us, a reminder of Grandpa's love, his wisdom, his legacy. And Josh? Josh had never cared about that. Not really. Not until it was something to fight over. I needed to confront him. I couldn't let him get away with this. But at the same time, I wasn't sure how to approach it. What was the right way to deal with this? To expose him in front of the family? To make him see the truth? My phone buzzed suddenly, snapping me out of my thoughts. Jenna's name appeared on the screen. You okay? I stared at the message for a moment, before typing back with a shaky hand. No, I need to confront Josh. He's lying. Grandpa gave me the cabin already. I don't know what to do. It felt good to share it with someone who understood, someone who could see the situation as it truly was. Jenna replied almost instantly, I can't imagine what you're feeling right now. But I know you're doing the right thing. If you need me, I'm here. I smiled bitterly as I read her words. Thanks. I think I'll head back there. I have to do this. For Grandpa. The decision was made. I couldn't put it off any longer. I needed to go back to Josh's house. I needed to make sure that he knew the truth. I grabbed the wooden box, feeling its weight once more, and made my way to the car. As I pulled out of the driveway, the night air felt colder than it had before. As if the world had shifted beneath me. Everything had changed. What had once been a family gathering had now turned into something else entirely. I wasn't sure what to expect when I got to Josh's house, but I knew I had to do this. For myself, for Grandpa, for the cabin that meant everything. The drive back was quieter than the first. I felt a sense of determination rising in me. A fire I hadn't known was there. When I got to Josh's house, I wasn't sure what would happen. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I needed to be calm. I needed to be composed. Grandpa had always taught me to speak the truth with grace, even when it was the hardest thing to do. And this was the hardest thing I had ever had to do. As I parked a block away, I took a deep breath and reminded myself of the truth. The truth that Josh had tried to erase. The truth that Grandpa had already given me the cabin. And now, it was time for that truth to come out. I grabbed the box from the passenger seat, my fingers still trembling, and walked up to the front door. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the quiet night as I walked up to Josh's front door. It felt like a lifetime since I'd last been here. Before everything changed, before the revelation, before the betrayal. The wooden box felt like a burden in my hands, heavier with each step. I stopped for a moment on the doorstep, gathering my thoughts. I could hear the faint murmur of voices from inside. The family was still there. The tension from earlier had barely dissipated. What kind of confrontation awaited me behind that door? I wasn't sure, but I knew I had to do it. I knocked. The sound was sharp, cutting through the thick air of uncertainty. A few seconds later, Josh answered, his face shifting from surprise to something else, something I couldn't quite place. He didn't invite me in. He just stood there, blocking the doorway with his body. "Work emergency over already?" he asked, his voice too casual, his eyes avoiding mine. I nodded, forcing a smile. "We need to talk, Josh." He didn't say anything immediately, just stepped back to allow me inside. The living room looked the same, decorated in the modern style that Josh always liked, his new life, his new house, his new beginning. All of it felt so hollow now. How could he have thought he could take something that wasn't his, something that meant so much to me with such ease? I stepped in, my gaze scanning the room for signs of anyone else. My parents were sitting together, looking over the letter Josh had claimed Grandpa wrote. Teresa sat beside them, deep in conversation, while Jenna, as usual, sat quietly in the corner. It was almost as if they were waiting for the inevitable. Jenna caught my eye for a brief moment. She gave me a small, supportive nod, but there was a certain sadness in her eyes. She had known something was off, long before any of us had put the pieces together. I returned the nod, trying to summon the strength I knew I would need for what was coming. "Jules is back," my mother announced, looking up from the letter she was holding, her voice too bright, too forced. We were just discussing Josh's wonderful news about the cabin. I set the wooden box down carefully on the coffee table, and their attention shifted instantly. Josh's eyes flickered toward the box, his expression momentarily faltering. There it was again, the look of recognition, as if he already knew what was coming. But I couldn't stop now. Not when the truth was right in front of us all. "Actually," I said, my voice steady despite the rush of emotions swirling inside me, "this is what I wanted to talk about." Josh's eyes widened, and he took a half step back as if preparing himself for something. "What's that?" he asked, though I could see the nervous tension tightening his jaw. I didn't hesitate. "Something Grandpa gave me 3 weeks ago," I said, keeping my voice calm. "He asked me not to open it until the time was right. I think that time is now." Before Josh could protest, my father leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "What is it, Jules?" I opened the box slowly, as if savoring the moment, and pulled out the first piece of paper. It was the notarized deed to the cabin. I laid it carefully on the coffee table beside Josh's letter, and my heart raced as I watched my father pick it up, his fingers tracing the edges. "6 months ago," I said quietly, my eyes never leaving Josh's. "Grandpa legally transferred ownership of the vacation home to me. It's already mine. It's not part of his estate or will." There was a long, heavy silence. My parents stared at the deed, first at the signature, then at each other. My mother's mouth dropped open in shock. My father's brow furrowed in confusion. Josh didn't move. His face drained of color, and he stood there, frozen, as if waiting for the world to swallow him whole. My father's voice was calm, though I could sense the tension in his words. "This is notarized," he said, lifting the document. "And this is definitely your grandfather's signature." Josh's gaze darted between the deed and his letter, the one he had presented so confidently just hours ago. "That's impossible," he said finally, his voice tight with disbelief. "Grandpa gave me the letter. He wanted me to have the cabin." I didn't let him finish. "May I see that letter again?" I asked, extending my hand toward my father. He handed it to me, and I placed it next to the deed. The difference was clear. The handwriting on Josh's letter was smooth, controlled, nothing like Grandpa's distinctive shaky scrawl. The signature was too perfect, too polished. It was an imitation. My mother, who had been silent up until now, reached for the letter, her face softening into a mix of confusion and disappointment. "Josh," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "did you forge this letter?" Josh's silence was answer enough. I could see his entire demeanor shift as the weight of his actions caught up with him. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, every unspoken word. My father cleared his throat, his voice tinged with disappointment. "Josh, regardless of how you feel, forging your grandfather's signature is serious." Josh's head hung low, his shoulders slumped. I could see the defiance fading from his eyes, replaced with something more raw, more vulnerable. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not fair. You always had Grandpa, you always got his attention, his approval. I just wanted something that was mine." His words hit me like a slap, though I didn't show it. He didn't understand. He didn't understand that it wasn't about the cabin. It wasn't about some piece of property. It was about what Grandpa had always believed in, the connection to something real, something meaningful, something that couldn't be stolen or manipulated. I took a deep breath. "It's not about winning," I said, my voice calmer now, though I still felt the sting of his betrayal. "It's about truth. And this cabin," I glanced at my father, then back to Josh, "was never yours to take." Josh shifted uncomfortably, and I could see the hurt in his eyes, the cracks forming in his carefully constructed defenses. The truth was unraveling before him, and I wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. After a long silence, Josh finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "I thought if I took it, if I claimed it first, maybe you'd give it to me. Maybe everyone would believe me instead of you for once." His voice broke, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Regret. I stared at him, my heart torn between the anger I felt and the compassion I knew I should have. "Josh," I said quietly, "you were always welcome there. Grandpa always invited you. But you never came." He looked up at me, eyes searching mine. "I didn't feel like I belonged there," he whispered. "I felt like an intruder." The words hit me harder than I expected. I didn't know what to say. But in that moment I realized something. Josh wasn't just angry about the cabin, he was angry about being left out, about never feeling like he measured up. The cabin had been a symbol for him of everything he thought he'd lost. I wasn't sure how to fix that, but I knew the truth needed to come out. It was the only way to start healing. The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken words. I could feel my pulse quickening, the adrenaline surging through me. There was so much I wanted to say, so much I had been holding back for so long. But now wasn't the time for anger or accusations. Grandpa had always taught me to approach difficult moments with grace, even when the world felt like it was falling apart. Josh stood there, his face pale, the weight of what he had done settling in. He was still silent, his body rigid, his eyes darting between me and the documents on the coffee table. I could almost hear his thoughts racing, his desperation, his need for something to hold on to. But he had nothing left but lies, and the truth was standing before him, laid bare for everyone to see. I could feel my father's eyes on me, waiting for the next move. He'd never been one to jump into the middle of family drama, but I could see the disappointment in his gaze, as if he, too, was searching for answers. My mother's expression was a mixture of shock and disbelief, as though she couldn't quite fathom the depth of Josh's betrayal. Teresa, who had been caught up in the excitement earlier, was now standing in the doorway, her face drained of color. She had no idea what to say, no words to offer in the face of the chaos unfolding around her. "Josh," I said softly, breaking the silence at last. My voice was steady, but the weight of the moment made it feel heavier than it should have. "Why did you do this? Why didn't you just tell the truth?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, his eyes clouded with confusion and frustration. "I didn't think you'd give it to me," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought if I claimed it first, if I told everyone it was mine, maybe you'd give it to me. Maybe I could finally have something of my own." I felt my chest tighten as I processed his words. It wasn't about the cabin, not really. It was about something deeper, something that had been festering for years. I had always been Grandpa's favorite. There was no denying that. I had spent the most time with him, shared the most memories with him, and somewhere along the way, Josh had been left behind feeling overshadowed, invisible. But that didn't excuse what he had done. "Josh," I said, my voice softer now, though the hurt was still there. "You've always had a place at the cabin. Grandpa invited you every time, but you never came. You were always too busy. And you know what? It wasn't about the cabin. It was about him, and about the memories we shared." I paused, the words I was about to say weighing heavily on me. "I never wanted to make you feel left out, but you shut us out. You chose not to be a part of it, Josh. Grandpa couldn't force you to care. And now—" I shook my head, feeling the lump form in my throat. "Now you've betrayed him, and you've betrayed me." Josh's eyes flickered, and I saw something there I hadn't seen before: vulnerability. His defiance was fading, replaced by something else. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words faltered, and he closed it again, his face a mixture of regret and frustration. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd find out." "You didn't think," I repeated softly. "But you knew what you were doing. You knew it was wrong, and you did it anyway. You tried to steal something that wasn't yours, Josh, and you didn't care about the consequences. You only cared about what you wanted." He winced at the truth in my words, but there was no denying it. The look in his eyes shifted again, this time to something deeper, something like shame, mixed with a realization that hit him harder than I ever could have. My father stood up then, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it I hadn't heard before. "Josh," he said, his tone clipped, "do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Josh didn't respond at first. His eyes were downcast, his hands clenched at his sides. I could see the weight of our accusations settling on him. His guilt was palpable, like a shadow he couldn't shake off. "I didn't mean for it to go like this," he muttered. I thought maybe if I got the cabin, maybe I'd feel like I belonged, like I was enough. I just wanted to matter." I blinked, stunned by the rawness in his confession. I had always known Josh was desperate for attention, for recognition, but I never understood how deep that hunger went. And in that moment I realized that the cabin had never been about the cabin at all. It was about proving something to himself that he couldn't find anywhere else. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. Josh, you matter. You've always mattered. But not like this. Not by taking what isn't yours. I paused, searching for the right words, the ones that would help him see the bigger picture. Grandpa gave me the cabin, not because he didn't care about you, but because I understood it the way he did. I loved it the way he did. But that doesn't mean you're worthless, or that you'll never matter. You don't need the cabin to prove that. Josh lifted his eyes to meet mine, his expression softening for the first time since the confrontation began. There was a crack in his armor, a flicker of the brother I had grown up with, the one who had laughed with me, fought with me, and shared memories with me. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make things right. The words hung in the air, heavy with regret. There was no easy fix, no quick resolution to the mess he had created. But in that moment, something shifted. Something fragile, but real. He wasn't asking for forgiveness yet, but he was acknowledging his mistake. And that, for now, was enough. I didn't know what to say at first. I had been so focused on my anger, on the betrayal, that I hadn't considered the bigger picture. But now, as I looked at Josh, I saw something else. A brother who had been lost, who had made a terrible choice, but who was still capable of change. We'll figure it out, I said quietly, my voice softening. But first, you need to come clean. You need to tell the family what you've done, all of it. Josh nodded, his head low. I know, I will. The silence that followed wasn't as heavy as before. It was a different kind of silence. A pause. A moment of reflection. Maybe this wasn't the end, but the beginning of something new. Something that started with honesty and accountability, even if it took us both a while to get there. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at Josh. He was still standing there, lost in thought. I couldn't tell if he was ready to truly change, but at least he was beginning to understand. And that was the first step. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a while, it felt like there was a chance to heal. The following moments were filled with quiet tension, like a pause between storms, but beneath it all, something shifted. Josh hadn't yet fully confronted the depth of his actions, but I could see the guilt weighing on him, hanging over him like a cloud he couldn't shake. I wanted to be angry, to scream at him for the betrayal, but as I watched him in the silence, I realized there was more to his actions than just selfishness. There was something deeper, something that had festered quietly for years, long before the cabin ever became a battleground. We stood in the living room, the weight of our words still heavy in the air. I wanted to leave, to put some distance between us, but something stopped me. There was more to say, something I needed to understand before I could move forward. Before I could even begin to forgive him. Josh finally broke the silence. His voice was quiet, unsure, as though he were wrestling with the words before they left his mouth. I never felt like I belonged, he said, his voice so small it almost seemed lost in the space between us. Not at the cabin, not with Grandpa, not in this family really. I blinked, taken aback by his confession. It wasn't the response I expected. I had always seen Josh as the confident, sometimes arrogant, older brother. The one who took everything for granted, the one who never seemed to care about the things I cared about. But now, standing in front of me, he was different, vulnerable, and for the first time I saw the cracks in the image he had built for himself. I don't understand, I said, my voice softer now, trying to make sense of his words. You were always invited. Grandpa always made space for you, Josh. He never shut you out. He looked away, his eyes darting to the floor. Yeah, but it never felt like that. It never felt like enough. I was always the one who didn't measure up, the one who wasn't good enough. Grandpa loved you, Jules. He always seemed to have time for you. He cared about you more. I felt a sharp pain in my chest as his words hit home. There it was, the unspoken truth that had been simmering between us for years. It wasn't just about the cabin. It was about Grandpa's love, about me, and about the way Josh had perceived it. He had felt like an outsider, even though he had never been shut out. I had never seen it from his perspective, never understood the depth of his feelings of neglect. Josh, that's not true, I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Grandpa loved you, he always did. But you... You never really gave him the chance to love you the way he loved me. You pushed him away." His head snapped up, and for a moment, our eyes locked. "I never meant to push him away," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "But I couldn't be like you, Jules. I couldn't just sit with him for hours, listening to his stories. I didn't understand what you saw in him. I didn't know how to connect with him the way you did." There was pain in his voice, raw and honest, and it made something inside me shift. I had always believed that Josh was just too self-centered to care. But now, I saw something else, a deep-seated insecurity, a longing for something I hadn't known he needed. He wasn't just jealous of the cabin or the property, he was jealous of me. Jealous of the bond Grandpa and I shared, of the love and attention I had received. "I didn't know you felt like that," I said, the words coming out more gently than I intended. I never knew that you felt like you didn't belong." Josh let out a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Of course you didn't. How could you? You always had everything, the love, the approval. I was always the one who was too loud, too much. Never quite enough." I didn't know how to respond. He wasn't wrong. Grandpa and I had a bond that was unique, but I had never considered how that might have made Josh feel. I had always assumed that if Josh wanted to be a part of it, he could have. But the truth was, maybe he didn't know how. Maybe he had been too proud to admit that he needed help. That he wanted to be a part of something that had always seemed just out of reach for him. "I never meant for you to feel like that," I said quietly, my voice filled with regret. "I never meant to make you feel like you didn't matter. But I wasn't the one who pushed you away. You did that, Josh. You were always too busy with other things. And when you did come to the cabin, it was only to complain about it, about how boring it was. Grandpa never stopped trying to get you involved, but you were the one who turned him down." Josh's face tightened, and I could see the guilt in his eyes. "I know, I was an idiot, but I didn't know how to be like you. I couldn't find my place there. And when I realized that the cabin was going to go to someone, I guess I just wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere." I felt a pang of sympathy, even though I didn't want to. I was angry, I was hurt, but hearing him say those words, hearing the vulnerability in his voice, it cut through my frustration. He wasn't trying to justify his actions, he was trying to explain them. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand where he had gone wrong. "I get it now," he continued, his voice softer. "I was jealous. I saw how much Grandpa loved you, and I wanted that for myself. But I went about it all wrong. I didn't know how to ask for what I needed, and I thought the cabin would fix everything." There it was, the core of it all. His jealousy, his need for validation, his desire for something tangible that could make him feel like he wasn't invisible. I understood now. He didn't just want the cabin for the cabin's sake. He wanted it because he believed that, somehow, having it would fill the emptiness he had been carrying around. "You're right," I said, the anger fading from my voice. "The cabin won't fix what's broken. It's not about the house or the property. It's about the memories, the connection. Grandpa knew that. That's why he gave it to me. He knew I was the one who understood it, who understood what it meant." Josh nodded, his eyes searching mine. "I think I'm starting to get that, but it doesn't make up for the way I've treated you. For the way I've treated Grandpa." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, I saw my brother clearly. He wasn't just the person who had hurt me, who had stolen my family's attention. He was someone who had been lost, someone who had struggled to find his place. He wasn't beyond redemption, and maybe, just maybe, he could still find his way back. "You're not beyond fixing, Josh," I said quietly. "But you need to be honest. You need to be honest with yourself first." The words hung in the air between us, a fragile hope starting to take root. Maybe this was the first step, the first real conversation we'd had in years, and maybe, just maybe, we could both find a way to heal, to move past the jealousy, the resentment, and the lies. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. The weight of silence hung between us for a long while, as Josh and I stood in the middle of the living room, both of us feeling the gravity of everything that had been said. For the first time, the tension that had plagued our relationship seemed to lift just a little. It was a small crack, but it was enough. But there was still so much left unsaid, so much that we had yet to confront. The family still needed answers, and the truth had to be laid bare for all to see. As if on cue, my father stood up, his voice steady but sharp. "So what now?" he asked, turning to look at Josh. "What happens from here?" Josh seemed to shrink under the weight of my father's words. His eyes darted to the ground, then to my mother, who was still holding Grandpa's letter, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. Teresa stood by the door, watching the scene unfold, her face a mix of disbelief and sadness. Jenna, ever the silent observer, met my eyes for a moment, a silent understanding passing between us. We all knew that this wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about the cracks in our family that had been there for years, hidden, silent, and now too loud to ignore. Josh opened his mouth to speak, but it was my mother who broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Josh, how could you do this?" she whispered. "Forge your grandfather's letter, to take what wasn't yours. How could you think that was okay?" Her words were soft, but they cut through the room with such quiet intensity that I almost flinched. My father's face hardened. And even Teresa looked away, unable to meet Josh's eyes. It was clear to all of us that what Josh had done wasn't just a mistake, it was a breach of trust, something far deeper than any of us had expected. I didn't think it would get this far," Josh said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't think it would cause all of this. I thought I could fix everything. I thought maybe if I had the cabin, maybe everything would make sense. Maybe I'd finally have a place where I belonged." His confession was raw, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. I could feel my stomach knotting again, the anger simmering beneath the surface, but I also felt something else, an old, familiar sadness creeping back into my chest. I had always known Josh felt left out, but I didn't realize how deeply it had affected him, how much he had struggled with his place in the family. But there was something more, something I hadn't expected. Grandpa had been prepared for this moment, as if he had known all along that this day would come. Maybe he had anticipated the jealousy, the lies, the confusion, and in his wisdom he had left us all a final message, a letter for Josh, the very letter Josh had tried to claim as his own. "Josh," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "there's something you need to see. Grandpa left something for you too. He knew what might happen. He knew this would be hard for you." I reached into the box and pulled out the last sealed envelope, the one I had kept hidden, the one Grandpa had addressed to Josh. Josh froze when he saw it, his face pale. He stepped forward, hesitant, as I handed it to him. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, the edges slightly worn from being handled. It felt heavy with meaning, as if it had been waiting for this moment, waiting to offer us all some final understanding. "I don't know what it says," I added quietly, my heart pounding in my chest. "But Grandpa? He knew." Josh took the envelope from my hands, his fingers trembling as he peeled it open. We all stood there, waiting, as he unfolded the letter inside. The room was still, the only sound the faint rustle of paper as he read. He paused a few times, his face changing with each line, as if the words were sinking in slowly, each sentence carrying more weight than the last. Finally he looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of surprise, disbelief, and something that looked like regret. He handed the letter to my mother, who, after a moment's hesitation, began to read aloud. "Dear Josh," my mother began, her voice shaky. "If you're reading this, then Jules has opened my cedar box, which means one of two things. Either I'm gone, or something has happened that made her feel it was necessary to reveal its contents. I've known you since the day you were born, and I know your heart." She paused, glancing up at Josh, who was still staring at the letter in her hands. His face was unreadable. "You've always wanted recognition and validation?" my mother continued, her voice trembling with each word. "Things I perhaps failed to give you in the way you needed, but I also know that when you feel overlooked, you sometimes make impulsive decisions that hurt others, and ultimately hurt yourself." There was a pause as my mother took a breath, her gaze softening as she continued reading. "The cabin has been transferred to Jules. This was a decision I made with great thought and love, not because I didn't care for you, but because Jules connected with the place in a way you never did. She understood what made it special to me, and I trust her to preserve that spirit." I could feel the tension in the room shift as my mother continued, her voice quivering ever so slightly. What you need, Josh, isn't a property, it's a purpose. I've enclosed a check for $25,000. Use it to start something meaningful. Find what makes your heart come alive, the way the cabin did for Jules. Maybe it's that business idea you mentioned last Christmas. Or perhaps something else entirely. I hope someday you'll understand that this isn't about favorites or fairness. It's about recognizing different paths for different hearts. I could see Josh's chest rise and fall with each breath as he listened to Grandpa's words, his hand clutching the letter, his face a mixture of confusion and awe. My mother stopped reading, her voice quiet in the aftermath of Grandpa's final message. "He left you something, Josh," my mother said softly, her voice a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Something to help you find your way." Josh's face crumpled then, and for the first time in a long while, I saw him for who he truly was. Lost, uncertain, and desperate for something to hold on to. He wasn't just after the cabin. He was searching for meaning in his life, something that had always seemed out of his reach. His voice broke as he spoke, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know he thought that. I didn't know he believed in me like that." My mother reached out, her hand resting gently on Josh's arm. "He always believed in you, Josh, but you have to believe in yourself." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Grandpa's letter hanging in the air. Josh looked at the check in his hands, then back at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something else, something that resembled hope. "I'm sorry, Jules," he whispered. "I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't know how to fix myself." I nodded, my voice soft. "I know, but this is a start." The silence in the room was no longer heavy with anger or resentment. It was heavy with the possibility of change, of healing, of a new beginning. Grandpa had left us all a gift, a chance to rebuild, to find our way, to reconnect. But it would take time. It wouldn't happen overnight. But now, we had the truth. And with the truth, we could start to heal. Together. "Let's go home," my father said quietly, his voice a steady anchor in the midst of everything. "We've got a lot of work to do, but we'll do it together." And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of his words sink in. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe we could still find our way back to each other. The drive back to the cabin was a quiet one. The weight of Grandpa's letter, the secrets finally revealed, hung over us all. But there was a sense of tentative relief, like the first signs of spring after a long, cold winter. The anger had dissipated, leaving room for something else, something softer, more fragile, but perhaps more powerful. It was the quiet understanding that, despite everything, we were still family, and that, no matter how fractured we had become, we still had a chance to heal. Josh sat beside me in the car, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He hadn't said much after we left the house, but I could see the thoughts churning in his mind. His fingers drummed nervously on the seat, his foot tapping out in erratic rhythm. But there was something different about him now. Something that had shifted, like the weight of his actions had started to sink in. I wanted to say something, to offer him comfort or advice, but the words felt hollow. This wasn't something that could be fixed in a few words. It wasn't something that could be solved with a simple apology. There was too much history, too many years of unspoken resentment between us. But perhaps that was what made this moment different. Josh wasn't looking for quick fixes anymore. He wasn't trying to gloss over the hurt. He was acknowledging it, slowly and painfully. But honestly, I glanced over at him, noting the way his shoulders were slumped, how his eyes were filled with a quiet sorrow. This wasn't the Josh I had known. This wasn't the confident, sometimes arrogant older brother. This was a person who had realized that the things he'd taken for granted, love, family, connection, were not as easy to claim as he had once thought. When we reached the cabin, the first light of morning was just beginning to stretch across the lake, casting a soft glow over the water. The familiar sight of the weathered cedar siding, the emerald green shutters, and the wide porch wrapped around three sides of the house brought a lump to my throat. It was everything I remembered, everything I had fought to protect. But it was also more now. It was a symbol of the healing that was possible, even if it would take time. Josh got out of the car before I did, his steps slow and uncertain as he walked toward the porch. I followed him, the silence between us no longer uncomfortable, but something we both needed. I didn't know what was going through his mind, but I could feel the weight of the moment pressing on both of us. When we reached the porch swing, I sat down first, my fingers tracing the worn edges of the seat. Josh hesitated for a moment before sitting beside me. The wood creaked under his weight, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, the quiet stretching out between us, until finally Josh broke it. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, his voice quiet, almost tentative. "About how I pushed everything away, about how I never gave Grandpa a chance. I've been thinking about all of it, about how I never really tried to be a part of this. I was too proud, I don't know, too angry, I guess." I turned to look at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. This wasn't the Josh I was used to. The Josh who would deflect, who would laugh it off, who would make a joke to cover up his feelings. This was the Josh who was finally confronting his own actions, his own mistakes. "I didn't know how to tell him," he continued. His eyes focused on the lake, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to tell Grandpa that I was struggling, that I felt like I didn't belong here. I didn't know how to ask for what I needed, and so I just stayed away." I nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. "You didn't have to do it alone, Josh. Grandpa would have helped you. He would have listened. He would have given you that space." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his frustration with himself evident in the motion. "I know that now, but I didn't know how to ask. I didn't know how to say I needed him. I didn't know how to let myself need him. And when I found out about the deed, when I saw that everything was already set in stone, I thought maybe if I took the cabin, if I claimed it first, maybe I'd finally be able to prove that I mattered." "You matter, Josh," I said, my voice soft but firm. "You always have. But the cabin, that was never the answer. You don't need to prove anything, not to me, not to Grandpa, not to anyone." Josh was silent for a moment, processing my words, his eyes fixed on the lake once again. The early morning mist hung over the water, the stillness of the scene reflecting the calm that was beginning to settle between us. I could feel the tension slowly dissolving, like the fog lifting from the surface of the lake. But there was still so much left unsaid. So many years of misunderstandings, of jealousy, of pain. Could we really move past it all? "I've got to make it right," Josh said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I have to. For myself, for Grandpa, for you." I felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, Josh was talking about making things right, not just for the sake of his own pride, but for the sake of our family, for the sake of what we had lost and what we could still have. "Making it right doesn't happen overnight," I said gently. "It takes time, but you've already started, just by being honest with yourself and with me." Josh turned to look at me then, his face filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time: vulnerability, openness. It was as if he was finally shedding the armor he had built around himself for so many years. And in that moment I knew we had a chance. We had a chance to rebuild, to reconnect, to heal. "I'm sorry, Jules," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the sincerity of his apology. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want to try. I want to make things right. For us." I smiled, a small but genuine smile, my heart heavy with the emotions I hadn't known I still carried. "We'll take it one step at a time," I said softly. "But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in years, I felt the weight of resentment and anger begin to lift. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be perfect, but there was hope now. There was a chance for something better. For both of us. We sat there for a long time, watching the sun rise over the lake, the world around us, still and peaceful. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back to each other. As the day began to unfold, I knew that Grandpa's legacy wasn't just in the cabin. It was in the chance to heal, to move forward, and to rebuild what had been broken. And maybe, just maybe, we could do that together. The sun had fully risen by the time we stepped off the porch, and the cabin seemed to breathe with the early morning light. The peaceful stillness that had always settled over the place felt different now. More alive, more meaningful. Grandpa's presence was still strong here, in the wood, in the lake, in the memories that lingered like whispers. But now, there was something else too. Hope. A quiet kind of hope, like a seed just beginning to push its way through the soil. Josh and I had spent the rest of the morning working together, small tasks at first, sweeping the porch, cleaning the windows, carrying the old fishing gear back into the shed. There was no rush, no pressure. We didn't speak much as we worked, but there was something in the air that had shifted. We weren't just doing chores, we were doing something else. We were healing, piece by piece. One action at a time, we were putting things back in place, both in the cabin and in our hearts. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It wasn't full of resentment or unspoken words. It was comfortable, like two people who had finally found their rhythm, who didn't need to say everything to understand each other. We were simply present, and that was enough. At lunch, we sat on the old porch swing, eating sandwiches we'd made together. Josh had been quieter than usual, but there was a calmness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. His eyes seemed clearer, his posture more relaxed. He wasn't trying to be the person he thought he should be anymore. He was just Josh. And that was more than enough. "I've been thinking about what Grandpa said in that letter," Josh said, breaking the silence, his voice low and thoughtful. "About finding what makes my heart come alive." I glanced at him, surprised by the depth in his words. It wasn't the kind of thing Josh would usually say. He was always so focused on the surface, on what was right in front of him. But now, there was a hint of something more. Something deeper. "I think I'm ready to figure that out," he continued. "I've spent so much of my life just chasing after things. Money, recognition, approval. And none of it ever felt like it meant anything. But maybe I need to figure out what really matters to me." "I think that's a good place to start," I said, nodding slowly. "It's never too late to figure that out, Josh. And you don't have to do it alone." He looked at me, a small, hesitant smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I know. I think I've been so focused on trying to be something I wasn't, I didn't realize what I already had. What I already had here." He gestured around the cabin, his eyes lingering on the lake, the trees, the land that had always been a part of our family. "Maybe this place is more than just a piece of property. Maybe it's something that can help me find my way." I smiled back at him, feeling a warmth spread through me. This was new. This was something I hadn't expected. But it was exactly what we needed. We spent the rest of the afternoon working on the cabin together, fixing things here and there, talking about the little things we had both ignored for so long. And somewhere along the way, I began to believe that this was more than just a one-time effort. This wasn't a fix that would be completed in a day, or even a week. This was the beginning of something we could build together if we were patient enough. As the sun began to set and the cabin took on the warm golden hues of twilight, Josh and I stood on the porch together, both of us looking out over the water. The sky was streaked with shades of orange and pink, and the first stars began to appear, just as they had when Grandpa would point them out to us, teaching us constellations and stories of the past. For a moment, the weight of everything, of the betrayal, the forgiveness, the years of misunderstanding, felt far away. The lake stretched out before us, endless and still, just as it had been when we were kids, when the world felt simple and full of possibility. Josh shifted next to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Jules. I know I can't undo everything, but I promise you, I'm going to try. I'm going to try to be better." I looked over at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the commitment to change that he had never been able to express before. He had been trying so hard to be someone else, someone who didn't feel left out, someone who didn't feel abandoned. But now, he wasn't trying to fit into someone else's mold. He was just Josh. And that, for the first time, felt enough. "I believe you," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "It's going to take time, but we'll get there, together." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace settle in my chest. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was ours to walk. Step by step we could rebuild what had been broken, not just the cabin, but our family. Our relationship. As we stood there, the last light of day fading into the night, I realized something else. Grandpa had always been ahead of us. He had known what we needed long before we did. He had trusted me with the cabin, with the legacy of our family, not because it was the easiest thing to do, but because he knew I would carry it forward with love, with patience, and with grace. And now, I had a new responsibility, not just to the cabin, but to the family that still needed me. To Josh, to myself, to healing. I glanced at Josh one last time before we both turned to head inside. The cabin was still our haven, our home, and maybe, just maybe, it could be the place where we both found our way back to each other. The door creaked open as we stepped inside, the familiar smell of cedar and old books filling the air, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that this was just the beginning. A beginning we could face together. The cabin, like us, wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough.